My name is Eleanor Vance. For the past 26 years, I have lived in Port Blossom, a small city nestled on the shores of Puget Sound, where the air smells of salt and rain-soaked cedar. At 52, my life had settled into a rhythm as predictable and comforting as the tides that lapped against our waterfront. I was the wife of Richard Vance, a man whose dreams were always as vast and turbulent as the Pacific Ocean he loved to gaze upon. I was the mother of Clara, our brilliant, compassionate daughter, the steady anchor in my world. And I was the head of accounting for Willow Creek Vineyards, a job that suited my quiet, methodical nature. My life was a well-tended garden, pruned and cared for, every branch and leaf in its proper place. I had convinced myself that this order was the same as happiness. The illusion shattered on a cool June evening, under the soft, ambient lighting of the Gilded Tern, a restaurant perched on a pier with panoramic views of the water. We were there to celebrate Clara's graduation from North Cascades University, an achievement that felt more like my own than any I had ever claimed. The room was filled with the warm hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faces of people we had called friends for decades. Richard stood, his champagne flute held high, a charming smile playing on his lips. He was supposed to be toasting our daughter. Instead, he said, "I've decided to start a new life without you." The words didn't crash through the room. They seeped into it, a sudden chilling fog that silenced the warmth. The murmur of conversation died. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The cheerful string quartet in the corner seemed to falter, the notes of a Vivaldi piece hanging, unresolved, in the air. 40 pairs of eyes swiveled from Richard to me, their expressions a mixture of shock, pity, and a terrible, hungry curiosity. They were waiting for the storm. For the tears, the accusations, the dramatic scene that would give them something to whisper about for weeks. A strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes in the eye of a hurricane. I looked at Richard, his handsome face still illuminated by the celebratory glow, and then at our daughter Clara, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief, the square mortarboard on her head suddenly looking like a cruel joke. I saw Ainsley, his much younger protégé from the marketing firm, sitting at a table in the back with some of our oldest friends. She stared down at her lap, her discomfort a small, telling beacon in the wreckage. These were the friends who had come to our summer barbecues, who knew about Richard's new passion project with Ainsley, and who had never, not once, met my eye with the truth in their own. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my own glass. A small, sad smile touched my lips. "To honesty," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It's a rare vintage." Then, with a composure that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, I reached into my leather satchel. I pulled out a simple manila folder, thick with documents, and placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth beside Richard's bread plate. His smile faltered, the practiced charm dissolving into confusion. "Eleanor? What's this?" "Something for your new life," I replied softly. I leaned over and kissed Clara's cold cheek. The scent of her hairspray and the faint perfume I'd given her for her birthday filled my senses, a grounding reminder of what truly mattered. "I am so proud of you, my love," I whispered for her ears only. "This day belongs to you. Don't let him take it." I stood, smoothing the silk of my navy blue dress. I addressed our stunned guests, my voice retaining its even keel. "Please, everyone, enjoy the wonderful salmon. It's a local specialty. Have a beautiful evening." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked with the measured pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going, even if she has never been there before. The heavy oak door of the restaurant swung shut behind me, muffling the sudden eruption of frantic whispers. Outside, the cool, misty air of the Pacific Northwest embraced me. It was a gentle reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere inside. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I took a deep, shuddering breath that filled my lungs completely. The scent of low tide and damp earth was the smell of freedom. The restaurant door flew open, its slam echoing across the damp planks of the pier. "Eleanor." Richard's voice was sharp with panic, stripped of its usual confident baritone. "What in God's name is in this folder? What have you done?" I kept walking toward the distant lights of the parking lot, a single tear finally tracing a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain but of release. The folder didn't contain revenge. It contained my resignation. Not from my job, but from a life where I had allowed myself to become a footnote in someone else's story. It contained the beginning of my own. For 26 years, I had been the bedrock to Richard's crashing waves. He was the dreamer, the charismatic entrepreneur who chased one glittering idea after another, leaving me to manage the debris when they inevitably collapsed. There was the boutique coffee roasting company, Vance & Company, Roasters, that folded after he discovered he had no patience for supply chain logistics. Then came the artisanal charcuterie business, which produced beautiful products but never a profit margin. Through it all, I was the steady hand, working extra hours at the vineyard, meticulously managing our finances, ensuring the mortgage was paid and Clara's college fund grew untouched. My own dream, a small financial guidance practice I tentatively called the Harbor Light, to help women navigate their own financial storms, was a ship I'd kept moored in a distant, hazy harbor. After Clara graduates, I'd always told myself, after Richard's next venture finally takes off. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared 4 months ago. Not with a bang, but with a quiet anomaly on a credit card statement. A charge for over $5,000 from Louvian Jewelers, a store I'd never entered. When I gently questioned Richard, he'd waved it away as a corporate gift for a potential investor, an explanation that felt as thin as the coastal fog. But my mind, trained for decades to notice discrepancies, couldn't let it go. It was a single thread, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I pulled it, our entire life would unravel. So I pulled. Quietly, late at night, after he was asleep, I began to piece together the truth. It wasn't an act of espionage. It was an audit of my own life. I found the separate savings account, opened a year prior, where small regular transfers from our joint account had accumulated into a sum of nearly $80,000. I found the emails with a realtor discussing down payments on a sleek, modern condo on Orcas Island, a place we had once dreamed of retiring to together. Then one evening I found his phone, left unlocked on the kitchen counter. The messages to Ainsley were not just about love and a new beginning. They were about me. They spoke of my predictability, my lack of spontaneity, my fixation on security. He wasn't just leaving me. He was leaving a version of me he had created in his own mind to justify his betrayal. The plan was all there. Announce his departure at the graduation dinner, a public severing that would frame him as a man bravely seeking his truth and me as the collateral damage, too stunned to object. What Richard had never understood was that my practicality was not a weakness. It was my strength. And he had forgotten the most practical thing we had ever done together. 26 years ago, as two idealistic young people, we had signed a prenuptial agreement. It was his idea. His father, a successful surgeon, had given him a small inheritance, and Richard, ever the businessman, wanted to protect his seed capital. I, with my modest savings and a belief in his dreams, had readily agreed. The document, drawn up by a stern lawyer in a stuffy downtown office, had long been forgotten, filed away with old tax returns and appliance warranties. But I had remembered it. And in its dense, legalistic prose it contained a fidelity clause, an old-fashioned provision stating that in the event of proven adultery, the division of assets would heavily favor the wronged party. While Richard was planning his grand escape, I was quietly building my lifeboat. I met with a compassionate, sharp-witted attorney named Sarah Chun. I documented every transfer, every email, every text message. I wasn't plotting a war. I was preparing for a peaceful, orderly withdrawal. I knew he would wait until after Clara's graduation, wanting to preserve his image as a doting father, so I set my own timeline. The divorce papers were filed that very morning, the record sealed by a judge until Monday. The folder I'd placed on the table contained copies of everything: the filing, the bank statements, the incriminating messages, and a highlighted copy of the prenup he had so proudly insisted upon. He thought he was orchestrating a dramatic exit. He had no idea I had already changed the locks on the life he planned to leave behind. I didn't go to a hotel. I drove home through the familiar tree-lined streets of Port Blossom. The mist was thickening, shrouding the world in a soft gray gauze. Our house, a beautiful cedar-shingled craftsman on a bluff overlooking the Sound, had always been my sanctuary. Tonight, it felt like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. I parked my sensible sedan in the driveway and walked inside. Everything was in its place. The gallery wall of Clara's school pictures, from a gap-toothed first grader to a poised high school senior. The old ship's clock from my grandfather, its gentle tick-tock the steady heartbeat of our home. The worn leather armchair where Richard and I had once sat, huddled under a blanket, planning a future that now seemed like a work of fiction. A profound sadness washed over me, a grief for the man I had loved, the partnership I had cherished, and the years I could never get back. Upstairs, in the walk-in closet of our shared bedroom, I found what I knew I would. Tucked behind his winter coats were two new, expensive-looking suitcases neatly packed. His favorite shirts, his designer jeans, the new cashmere sweater I'd given him for his birthday. He was ready to leave tomorrow morning. A sad smile touched my lips, born of a predictability I knew too well. He was always so meticulous about the small things, and so careless with the things that truly mattered. My phone began to buzz incessantly. Messages from concerned friends, from my sister-in-law Margaret, who had flown in from Portland for the graduation, and a string of frantic texts from Clara. I answered only one. "I'm home and I'm safe, my love. This is not your weight to carry. Please try to enjoy your night with your friends. We'll talk in the morning. I love you more than words can say." I knew she would be hurt that I hadn't confided in her. But how could I have burdened her with this during her final triumphant semester? She was on the cusp of her own life. She didn't need to be dragged back into the wreckage of ours. Clara had my quiet determination and her father's dazzling charm. A potent combination that would serve her well. She would understand eventually. A few hours later, the sound of Richard's sports car skidding to a halt in the gravel driveway broke the silence. The front door slammed open with a force that rattled the windows. "Eleanor." His voice, raw and ragged, echoed through the quiet house. "Where are you?" I was in the sunroom, curled in a wicker chair, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. I had been watching the lights of a distant ferry glide across the dark water. I didn't move. He found me there, his face pale and slick with sweat, the manila folder clutched in his hand like a weapon. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, shaking the papers at me. "Divorce papers? You filed for divorce today." "I felt it was appropriate," I said, my voice quiet. "You were starting a new life. I thought it best we make a clean break." "You had no right." "I had every right, Richard," I interrupted, my gaze unwavering. "You made your choice. I am simply making mine." A flicker of his old arrogance returned. "This is a bluff. That prenup is ancient history. It expired decades ago. Any lawyer will tell you." I took a slow sip of my tea. "Actually, they won't. Sarah, my lawyer, reviewed it quite thoroughly. Article 7, subsection C, the fidelity clause and the asset division outlined within it, remains in effect for the entire duration of the marriage. Do you remember insisting on that part? You said it was to ensure we both remained fully invested in the partnership." The color drained from his face. The reality of his miscalculation began to dawn on him. The agreement he had created to protect a small inheritance would now cost him almost everything we had built together. The house, his share of our investment portfolio, the pension I had so carefully managed. His grand romantic gesture was about to become the most expensive speech of his life. "You can't," he whispered, slumping against the doorframe. "Eleanor, we built this life together." "Yes, we did," I said, a wave of sorrow washing over me. "And you were willing to burn it to the ground for a new beginning. The only difference is, you thought you'd be the one holding the match." His phone buzzed, a shrill, insistent sound in the quiet room. He glanced at it and winced. Ainsley, no doubt, wondering about the change of plans. "You've always been so methodical," he said, his voice laced with a new desperate bitterness. "But this is cold-blooded." "Is it?" I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in months. The man I had shared a bed with for nearly 30 years. The man who had held my hand through a frightening health scare. Who had cried with joy the day Clara was born. Where did that man go? Or was he just another one of Richard's brilliant, fleeting creations? "What was cold-blooded, Richard?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Was listening to you tell our friends we had to tighten our belts for retirement, while you were secretly buying $5,000 necklaces for another woman. What was cold-blooded was planning to humiliate me in front of our daughter on the proudest day of her life." His face hardened. "You don't know the whole story." "I think I do." I reached for my own phone and played a short voice memo I had recorded 2 weeks ago, when he'd been on a business call in his home office, the door ajar. It was his voice, smooth and confident, speaking to his lawyer. No, she has no idea about the Orcas condo. Eleanor trusts me completely. Her focus is always on the budget, the spreadsheet. She lacks imagination. He stared at my phone as if it were a snake. You recorded me? I believe the term is building a record, I said softly. I didn't seek it out, but when the truth wanders into your home, you have a right to document it. He stood, looking trapped and suddenly much older. I need to call my lawyer. That sounds like a good idea, I said, rising from my chair. I'll be staying with Margaret for a few days. Margaret, he sputtered. My sister. Yes. She was quite disappointed to learn about your new business venture, I said. She saw you and Ainsley at a wine bar in Portland last month. She confronted you. You told her it was over. When she realized you had lied, she called me. She was worried about me. It was another blow he hadn't seen coming. He and his sister were close, but he had always underestimated the bond Margaret and I had forged over years of family holidays and late-night phone calls. Everyone is turning against me, he muttered, looking utterly lost. It must feel that way when the consequences of your own actions arrive, I said, gathering my purse and a small overnight bag I had packed that afternoon. The movers will be here on Monday to help you with your things. The house needs to be vacated by the end of the week, as per the agreement. As I walked toward the front door, he called out, his voice cracking. What about Clara? Did you even think about how this will destroy her? I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, a surge of pure, protective anger momentarily eclipsing my sadness. Don't you dare, Richard, I said, turning to face him. Don't you dare hide behind our daughter. You weren't thinking of her when you planned to detonate our family in a public restaurant. You were only thinking of yourself. You have been for a very long time. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Ainsley, he mumbled. She's at the apartment we were supposed to lease. She's already moved some of her boxes in. A flicker of something, not triumph but a grim sense of cosmic justice, passed through me. The one in the Bellwether building? The application was denied. They called the house to verify some of your financial information last week. I handled the call. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool, damp night, leaving him alone in the beautiful house that was no longer his, to face the unraveling of a future he had so carefully and so carelessly planned. Margaret's home was a small, book-filled cottage nestled in a quiet neighborhood near the university. The air inside smelled of old paper, lavender and brewing tea. She greeted me at the door not with questions, but with a fierce, encompassing hug that spoke volumes. I put the kettle on, she said, leading me into her cozy kitchen. Clara called. She's on her way over. Are you holding up? I feel strangely peaceful, I admitted, sinking into a worn armchair as she poured 2 mugs of Earl Grey. It's the calm after a storm I didn't even realize I was living in. He always had a flair for the dramatic, Maggie said, her brow furrowed with a mixture of anger and sadness. But to do that at Clara's celebration in front of everyone. He's lost his way, completely. It was a strategy, I explained, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. A public execution, so I'd be too shamed and stunned to fight back. He underestimated me. He always has, she said grimly. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, a mirror image of the one in my own home. Maggie, a tenured history professor, had always been a source of wisdom and stability in my life. She had never married, content with her books, her students, and her independence. I had often admired her clear-eyed view of the world. When Clara arrived, she was still wearing her beautiful graduation dress, but her eyes were red-rimmed and her youthful face was etched with a pain that broke my heart. She didn't speak, just collapsed into my arms, her body trembling with silent sobs. Why didn't you tell me, Mom? She finally whispered into my shoulder. You've been carrying this all alone. Oh, my sweet girl, I said, stroking her hair. Your only job was to finish your degree and be brilliant. This was my burden, not yours. I didn't want his choices to cast a shadow on your achievement. She pulled back, her eyes flashing with a spark of my own resolve. Well, he cast the shadow himself, didn't he? We sat together on Maggie's floral sofa, and I told her everything. The financial discoveries, the secret plans, the depth of the deception. She listened intently, her initial shock hardening into a quiet, resolute anger. I knew something was wrong, she admitted, her voice low. He was so distant, always on his phone, smiling at things that weren't there. I thought he was stressed about work. We see what we want to see in the people we love, Maggie said gently, placing a comforting hand on Clara's arm. Just then the doorbell rang. Maggie's expression tightened as she went to answer it. A moment later she returned, her face a mask of weary exasperation. It's your father, she said to Clara. And he brought his associate. I took a deep breath and centered myself. Richard and Ainsley stood awkwardly in the entryway. Ainsley looked pale and genuinely distraught, her eyes darting around the cozy intellectual chaos of Maggie's living room as if she had landed on a foreign planet. She was in her late 30s, a polished woman whose confidence seemed to have deserted her. Richard, however, looked furious. His initial shock had morphed into self-righteous indignation. Eleanor, this has gone far enough, he said, foregoing any greeting. You need to call your lawyer and stop this insanity. We can be reasonable. Clara stood up, positioning herself between us. It was a gesture of such fierce loyalty that it almost brought me to tears. Reasonable, she said, her voice dripping with scorn. Was it reasonable to announce you were leaving Mom in the middle of my graduation toast? Richard looked at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. This is between your mother and me, Clara. It doesn't concern you. It doesn't concern me, she fired back, her voice rising. My family is imploding on the one day that was supposed to be about my future, and it doesn't concern me? Ainsley put a tentative hand on Richard's arm. Richard, maybe this isn't the time. He shook her off. No, I'm not leaving until she agrees to stop this scorched earth campaign. The only person who scorched the earth here was you, Richard, Maggie said, her arms crossed. Eleanor is simply trying to find solid ground to stand on. I remained seated, an observer of the drama he had authored. The role of peacemaker, the one I had played for 26 years, felt like a costume I had finally taken off. It was heavy and I was tired of wearing it. The legal process has begun, I said, my voice calm and clear. The assets are frozen pending a hearing. That's the way it works, Richard. It's not a campaign, it's the law. Frozen, he choked out. What am I supposed to do? You have your secret savings account, I reminded him. The $80,000 you siphoned off. I imagine that will be sufficient for your immediate needs. Ainsley's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with shock. You have a separate account? You told me your money was all tied up in joint assets. The foundation of their new life was already cracking. He had built it on a bedrock of lies, and the lies were now eroding beneath his feet. This isn't you, Eleanor. He tried again, his tone shifting to one of wounded intimacy. This is vindictive. Perhaps you never really knew me, I replied softly. Perhaps I'm only just starting to know myself. Clara turned her attention to Ainsley, her gaze direct and unflinching. Did you know? About his plan for the dinner. Ainsley flushed, looking genuinely ashamed. No, I swear I didn't. He told me he was going to talk to your mother privately, that it would be amicable. What happened tonight? It was horrible. Richard shot her a look of pure betrayal. I think it's time for you both to go, Maggie said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You've caused enough pain for one day. Clara, Richard pleaded, turning to his daughter one last time. People change. Marriages end. It's a part of life. Her face was like stone. What I understand, Dad, is that you lied. You lied to Mom, you lied to me, and you were stealing from our family. You told me money was tight, that I should apply for more student loans, while you were planning to buy a condo on Orcas Island. So please don't talk to me about life. The finality in her voice was absolute. Defeated, Richard turned and left, with Ainsley trailing numbly behind him. As the door closed, Clara sank onto the sofa beside me and finally let the tears fall. I've never spoken to him like that in my life, she sobbed. I wrapped my arms around her. Sometimes, I said, holding her tight. The most loving thing we can do is tell the truth. Maggie returned with 3 glasses and a bottle of good Chardonnay from Willow Creek. To new chapters, she said, raising her glass. To new chapters. I echoed, my heart full of a strange and potent mix of grief and hope. This ending, I knew, was also a beginning. The legal proceedings were less a battle and more a quiet, methodical dismantling of a shared life. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad. The evidence of Richard's financial infidelity irrefutable. His hastily hired lawyer, a young man who specialized in corporate litigation, was hopelessly out of his depth. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, awarded me the house, my full pension, and the lion's share of our joint investments, exactly as the contract stipulated. Richard was left with his struggling consulting business, his personal belongings, and the secret account, which was significantly depleted after paying his legal fees. The aftermath was a quiet ripple. Ainsley, I heard through the grapevine, had moved to Seattle a month after the divorce was finalized, having discovered that Richard's charm was not backed by the financial security he had promised. Friends who had been complicit in their silence slowly drifted away, their awkward phone calls eventually ceasing altogether. I began to rebuild. The first thing I did was reclaim my name. I was no longer Mrs. Richard Vance, a supporting character. I was Eleanor Vance. I sold the large Craftsman on the Bluff, it held too many ghosts, and bought a small light-filled townhouse in the historic Fairhaven district, with a garden patio and a view of the marina. With the security I had fought for, I finally opened the Harbor Light Financial Guidance. I started small, with a modest office above a bookstore. My clients were women like me, women who had found themselves adrift in the wake of a divorce, a death, or a sudden career change. I didn't just help them with budgets and investments. I helped them find their footing, to build their own lifeboats. The work was more fulfilling than anything I had ever done. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about empowerment. It was about turning fear into a plan. A year after the divorce, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I was sitting on a bench by the water, watching the Alaska ferry prepare for its long journey north. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor, it's Richard. I know I have no right to ask, but I was wondering if you might be willing to meet for coffee. There are things I need to say. My first instinct was to delete the message. But as I watched the ferry glide out of the harbor, I felt a sense of peace, not anger. I had navigated my storm. I was safe in my harbor. We met at a small cafe near the train station, a neutral place filled with the transient energy of travelers. He looked older. The charismatic confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He had lost his business and was now working a modest sales job. He was living in a small apartment across town. He was, for the first time in his life, living within his means. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice quiet. "Richard," I acknowledged with a small nod. He stirred his coffee, his gaze fixed on the cup. "I wanted to apologize," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were clear of the old deceptions. "Not to ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but to apologize. For everything. For the lies, for the cruelty of how I ended things, for taking you for granted for so many years. You were the best thing in my life, Eleanor, and I was too foolish and too arrogant to see it." Tears pricked my eyes, but I did not let them fall. "Thank you," I said softly. "I appreciate that. I've been talking to a therapist," he continued, trying to understand why I did what I did. This need to always be chasing something new, this fear of being ordinary. I destroyed the most extraordinary thing I ever had in the process. He looked out the window at the passing cars. "How is Clara?" "She's thriving," I said, a genuine smile lighting my face. "She's been promoted at her marketing firm in Seattle. She's happy." "Is she? Does she ever talk about me?" "We talk about you," I answered honestly. "It's still difficult for her, Richard. You hurt her deeply." He nodded, accepting the truth without argument. "I know. I'm hoping that someday, I can earn back a small piece of her respect." He paused, then looked at me, a genuine curiosity in his eyes. "And you? Margaret told me you started your own business." "I did," I said. "The Harbor Light. It's going well. I love the work." "The Harbor Light," he repeated, a sad smile touching his lips. "That's perfect. You were always my harbor light, Elle. I just kept sailing toward the rocks instead. We sat in a silence that was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with the weight of 26 years of shared history. There was no going back. The life we had built was gone. But in its place, two separate individuals were slowly, painfully finding their way. As I left the cafe, I felt a profound sense of closure. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, melancholy acceptance. The path to my new life hadn't been paved with the stones of revenge, but with the quiet, steady work of self-respect and the courage to build healthy boundaries. The woman who had once defined herself by her husband and her daughter had discovered a new identity, one she had forged herself. I was Eleanor Vance, mentor, business owner, a woman who had learned to navigate her own waters. The folder I had handed Richard that night hadn't just been my escape plan. It had been a declaration that my story was my own to write, and the most beautiful chapters were still to come.